Harlem in the 1930s did not wake gently. It stirred like a restless giant, stretching beneath a sky smudged with factory smoke and ambition, where street vendors shouted beneath fire escapes and church bells rang against the rumble of elevated trains. The neighborhood carried both melody and bruise, jazz drifting from open windows while injustice lingered in courthouse corridors downtown. It was a place where dignity had to be defended daily, not always with fists or fire, but with composure. So steady it unsettled those who mistook loudness for authority. Ellsworth, Bumpy, Johnson walked those streets as if he were listening to a song only he could hear. He was not tall, not flamboyant, and never reckless with his words. His suits were pressed, his shoes polished, his gaze level. Children nodded respectfully when he passed. Shopkeepers straightened their shoulders. Even the men who disagreed with him did so carefully. He carried books under his arm as often as he carried responsibility, quoting poetry with the same ease others quoted threats. In a world that often tried to define him by stereotype, he insisted on defining himself by intellect and restraint. But power, especially when exercised by a black man in that era, made certain people uneasy downtown, in rooms lined with cigar smoke and polished mahogany. The old guard of organized crime still clung to influence they believed was ordained. Dutch Schultz had once been one of those towering figures, a man whose name was spoken with equal parts admiration and fear during Prohibition's roaring heights. Though time and federal scrutiny had chipped at his empire, his legend remained, etched in the underworld's mythology. He represented a fading era, brash, domineering, convinced that intimidation was the purest form of control. Harlem, in his view, had always been territory to manage, never to respect. But Harlem was changing, and Bumpy Johnson was part of that change. Where others saw turf wars, Bumpy saw community stability. Where others saw profit margins, he saw families trying to survive beneath systems stacked against them. He did not pretend to be a saint. He understood the compromises of his environment. Yet he operated by a code that valued order over chaos and dignity over humiliation. He funded school supplies quietly, ensured widows received rent money discreetly, and mediated disputes before they erupted into bloodshed. His influence was rooted not in spectacle, but in reliability. That difference unsettled those who preferred fear. The tension between Harlem's rising autonomy and downtown's lingering ego simmered like a pot left too long on flame. Schultz's remaining associates whispered that Bumpy was becoming too comfortable, too respected. They viewed respect as a threat because it could not be extorted. It had to be earned. One autumn evening, as golden leaves gathered in the gutters of Lenox Avenue, a confrontation unfolded not in gunfire, but in humiliation. Bumpy had been invited to a meeting at a downtown club, a place where crystal chandeliers glowed over polished floors and where black men were tolerated only when useful. The invitation came through intermediaries, framed as a gesture of reconciliation. A conversation about balance, they had called it. Bumpy understood the language. Balance often meant submission. He arrived precisely on time, coat collar smooth, hat brim angled just enough to shade thoughtful eyes. The mater d' hesitated before leading him inside. Conversations quieted as he entered. Several men at the central table, Schultz's former lieutenants, faces lined with suspicion, watched him approach as though observing an unexpected variable in a familiar equation. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with slicked-back hair and a cigar clamped between yellowed teeth, gestured lazily toward a chair. "Harlem's been busy," he said, voice dripping with insinuation. "Almost independent." The room laughed, but the laughter lacked warmth. Bumpy sat without hurry. "Harlem has always been independent," he replied evenly. "It simply remembers that fact now." A pause followed. The cigar man leaned forward. "You forget who allowed certain arrangements." "I forget nothing," Bumpy answered softly. "But permission and partnership are not the same." The exchange was civil on the surface, yet tension pulsed beneath every syllable. Then came the deliberate insult. A waiter placed a drink before Bumpy, but instead of setting it gently on the table, he allowed a splash to spill across the cloth and onto Bumpy's sleeve. The room watched closely, anticipating outrage. It was a small act, petty yet intentional. Designed to provoke reaction and reinforce hierarchy, Bumpy glanced down at the stain. He removed a folded handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed the fabric calmly. He did not raise his voice. He did not glare at the waiter. Instead, he looked directly at the cigar man and said, "Accidents reveal more about intention than apology ever could." The laughter died instantly. The insult had failed. The power dynamic had shifted, not through aggression, but through composure. That evening ended without resolution, but words spread through Harlem like a hymn. Bumpy had walked into a room designed to diminish him and walked out unchanged. For a community accustomed to daily indignities that mattered. It was not about pride alone. It was about possibility. If one man could refuse humiliation without losing authority, perhaps others could too. Yet pride wounded in private often seeks revenge in shadows. Weeks passed. Downtown murmurs grew sharper. An example needed to be made, some believed. Respect, after all, was contagious. Harlem's nights remained alive with music. The Savoy ballroom shimmered with rhythm, couples gliding across polished floors while brass instruments carried both joy and defiance. Bumpy often visited, not as a king surveying subjects, but as a man savoring culture. He would sit near the bandstand, listening to Duke Ellington's melodies drift like silk through smoke. On a December night thick with winter chill, he entered the Savoy as usual. Children playing outside paused to wave. Inside, musicians tuned their instruments. The atmosphere felt electric yet ordinary. What no one knew was that a man had arrived in Harlem earlier that afternoon with a folded envelope and a restless conscience. He was not a monster, merely a product of desperation and loyalty misplaced. He had been told that Harlem needed reminding of its place, that Bumpy Johnson was growing too influential, too admired. He had been told that strength required spectacle. As the band began a slow, haunting tune, the man stepped through the Savoy's doors. He did not rush. He did not shout. He moved with the stiff resolve of someone rehearsing a terrible decision. Bumpy noticed him instantly, not because he looked dangerous, but because he looked conflicted. A man determined to kill often carries certainty. This one carried something heavier, doubt. Their eyes met across the dance floor. Time seemed to hesitate. The man approached. Conversations dimmed. Musicians faltered slightly, sensing disruption. When he reached Bumpy's table, his hand slipped into his coat. Gasps rippled through the room. The blade flashed. Chairs scraped violently. Women screamed. Musicians ducked behind instruments. The attack was sudden, frantic, chaotic. Yet amid this storm of motion, one thing remained astonishingly still. Bumpy Johnson did not panic. He rose halfway from his chair, not to strike, but to steady himself. His eyes locked onto his attacker's face, not with hatred, but with piercing calm. It was a look that said, "You do not know what you are doing." The blade struck again and again, fueled by fear rather than rage. Security lunged forward. Men tackled. The attacker. The chaos swelled, then fractured into shouts and cries. And still, through blood and confusion, Bumpy remained upright. He lifted his hand not in defense, not in retaliation, but in command. "No more." He said 2 words. The room obeyed. Even the man restrained on the floor seemed stunned, as though expecting curses or vengeance. Instead, he saw composure. Not weakness - composure. Police arrived. Ambulances followed. The headlines the next. Morning would count wounds, dramatize numbers, sensationalize survival. But the true story was not how many times a blade fell. It was what refused to fall. In the hospital, Under sterile lights and hushed corridors, Bumpy drifted in and out of consciousness. Doctors worked tirelessly. Nurses whispered about miracles. Outside, Harlem gathered silently. No riots, no retaliation. Just vigil. Inside his room, a young orderly barely 20 hesitated before speaking. "Mr. Johnson," he said softly, "why didn't you fight back?" Bumpy's voice was weak but steady. "Because sometimes the loudest answer is restraint." The orderly swallowed hard, absorbing the lesson. Days later, when Bumpy finally appeared at the hospital window, bandaged yet standing tall, a collective breath released across Lenox Avenue. Tears glistened in eyes hardened by decades of injustice. He did not raise a fist. He did not promise revenge. He simply inclined his head in gratitude. The message was clear. Dignity survives. Downtown, the reaction was more complicated. Some expressed disbelief. Others felt unease. The spectacle meant to instill fear had instead inspired solidarity. Violence, intended as dominance, had revealed desperation. The attacker, now facing charges, reportedly asked a guard why Bumpy had not demanded harsher punishment. The guard shrugged. "Maybe he's stronger than the rest of you." Strength, after all, is not measured by destruction, but by what one refuses to destroy. Harlem resumed its rhythm. The Savoy reopened. Trumpets rose again. But something intangible had shifted. Parents told their children about composure. Pastors spoke of dignity in sermons. Shopkeepers straightened their backs a little higher. Bumpy returned to the streets weeks later, walking slowly but upright. Scars hidden beneath tailored cloth served as reminders, not of weakness but of endurance. When he passed the corner where young boys once argued over trivial slights, they quieted instinctively, recognizing that real power required neither shouting nor spectacle. The injustice had been real. The humiliation attempts to liberate, the violence undeniable. Yet the response had rewritten the narrative. Harlem did not celebrate bloodshed. It celebrated survival with honor intact. And in rooms downtown where arrogance once reigned unchallenged, a new realization began to take root. Control built on fear is fragile. Influence grounded in respect endures. Bumpy Johnson had not needed to raise his voice to change the tone of a city. He had simply stood still while chaos exhausted itself. The night the blade failed to conquer composure became legend, not because it glorified harm, but because it revealed a deeper truth. Kindness does not mean weakness. Restraint does not mean surrender. And dignity, once demonstrated publicly, can ripple through a community like music through an open window. Harlem listened, and it remembered. Winter settled over Harlem like a heavy curtain after the chaos of that unforgettable night. And though the snow softened rooftops and muffled carriage wheels along 7th Avenue, nothing could quite muffle the memory of what had happened inside the Savoy Ballroom. The headlines had screamed about blades and blood, counting wounds as if numbers alone could measure courage. Yet the people of Harlem spoke of something far different. They spoke of the way Bumpy Johnson had remained standing, not merely in body but in spirit, and of how 2 simple words no more had restored order to a room on the brink of hysteria. The story traveled beyond Lenox Avenue, across the East River, and into the very offices where men like Dutch Schultz once dictated terms with cold authority. And in those rooms, a deeper tension began to brew, not because Bumpy had survived, but because he had survived with dignity intact. Downtown's power brokers understood violence. They understood retaliation. What they did not understand was restraint that inspired loyalty. In the weeks that followed, Harlem did not erupt in revenge. There were no retaliatory ambushes, no reckless gunfire echoing against brownstone walls. Instead, something far more unsettling took place. Ministers preached unity from pulpits. Mothers brought food to the Johnson household. Young men who once hovered dangerously close to street trouble began volunteering at storefront businesses, determined to protect their own community without becoming the monsters others expected them to be. Harlem had responded to brutality. With solidarity, that was dangerous. Because solidarity could not be bought. Dutch Schultz, though his golden era had dimmed, still commanded enough influence to be feared. Age and federal pressure had tempered his once flamboyant confidence into something colder, more calculating. He had built his legend on dominance during Prohibition, but times had changed, and Harlem was no longer willing to kneel as easily as it once had. What unsettled him most was not Bumpy's physical survival, but the emotional aftermath. Respect was spreading, and respect, once rooted, reshaped entire landscapes. One evening, in a dimly lit Manhattan office overlooking the East River, Schultz sat behind a broad oak desk, fingers drumming slowly against polished wood. The skyline beyond his window flickered with ambition and rivalry. Across from him stood two former associates who had witnessed Harlem's reaction firsthand. They spoke cautiously, explaining how Bumpy had returned to the streets without threats, without bravado, and yet with more authority than ever. He didn't even curse the man who attacked him, one of them admitted quietly. Schultz leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. Then he's either a fool, he muttered, or he's something worse. Worse how? Patient. The word hung heavy. Patience, Schultz knew, was often the foundation of empires. It required discipline. It required vision beyond immediate gratification. And if Harlem was learning patience under Bumpy's quiet guidance, then the balance of influence was shifting far more profoundly than a single violent incident could reveal. Meanwhile, Harlem carried on beneath winter skies. Jazz clubs reopened with cautious optimism. Street vendors wrapped scarves tighter around their necks as they sold roasted chestnuts. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythms, tension simmered. There were whispers of economic pressure being applied from downtown shipments delayed. Credit lines suddenly tightened. Landlords subtly encouraged to raise rents in specific neighborhoods. It was a quieter form of retaliation, one that avoided headlines but pressed hard against families already struggling. Bumpy noticed. He did not storm into offices demanding answers. He did not gather men for confrontation. Instead, he began visiting small businesses personally. He listened more than he spoke. He asked careful questions. He calculated quietly. Where others saw isolated inconveniences, he saw a coordinated pattern designed to weaken Harlem's confidence. And injustice disguised as bureaucracy angered him more than open hostility ever could. One afternoon, he stepped into a modest grocery owned by an elderly couple who had served the community for decades. Shelves stood half empty. The husband's hands trembled as he explained that their usual supplier had abruptly canceled deliveries without reason. A letter from the bank followed days later, hinting at reassessment of their loan. They had never missed a payment. "They want us gone," the wife whispered, her voice cracking. "They think we won't fight." Bumpy's jaw tightened slightly, though his expression remained calm. "You won't need to fight," he replied softly. "You'll need to endure." That night, he convened a meeting, not in a smoky backroom, but in the basement of a church on 135th Street. The pews were pushed aside. Shopkeepers, barbers, tailors, and mothers gathered in quiet anticipation. There was no grand speech, no threats. Bumpy stood at the front, hands clasped behind his back. "They expect panic," he began. His voice carried evenly across the room. "They expect anger. They expect us to turn on each other." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "What they do not expect," he continued, "is unity." He laid out a plan that was neither violent nor reckless. Businesses would pool resources temporarily. Suppliers within Harlem would support one another. Credit would be extended internally where possible. Every dollar spent would circulate locally before crossing the river. The goal was not retaliation, but resilience. An elderly barber raised his hand. "And if they tighten the pressure?" Bumpy paused, then answered quietly, "Then we tighten our resolve." It was not the kind of declaration that stirred fists into the air. It stirred something deeper: commitment. Weeks passed. The strategy worked slowly but steadily. Harlem businesses adapted. Community funds filled gaps. Churches organized food drives. Where downtown had anticipated desperation, they found discipline instead. Economic pressure met organized calm. Yet power structures rarely surrender gracefully. One icy evening, as Bumpy walked alone along a snow-dusted sidewalk, he sensed movement behind him. Not the clumsy approach of a reckless attacker, but the deliberate pacing of someone sent to deliver a message. He did not turn immediately. He allowed the footsteps to draw closer. "Mr. Johnson," a voice called softly. Bumpy turned then, recognizing one of Schultz's longtime intermediaries. The man looked uneasy, glancing around to ensure privacy. "There's talk," the intermediary said. "They think you're trying to embarrass them. This unity thing, they're not used to being ignored." Bumpy's expression remained unreadable. "I am not responsible for their comfort. They're considering something larger," the man warned. "Something that won't look like business pressure." Silence settled between them, snowflakes drifting through street lamp glow. "Tell them," Bumpy said finally, "that dignity does not negotiate under threat." The intermediary swallowed hard. "You're not afraid?" Bumpy's gaze shifted briefly toward the Harlem skyline, church steeples, apartment windows, glowing warm against cold night. "Fear," he replied calmly, "is useful only when it teaches caution. It is useless when it demands surrender." The intermediary left, carrying not just words, but realization. Days later, an invitation arrived. Once again from downtown, this time more formal, framed as a private dialogue meant to restore cooperation. Many urged Bumpy to refuse, others feared a trap. Yet he accepted. The meeting took place in a grand Manhattan hotel ballroom, emptied of guests. Crystal chandeliers cast reflections across polished marble. Schultz stood near a window, hands folded. Behind his back, posture still radiating remnants of former dominance. Age had etched sharper lines into his face, but his eyes remained calculating. "You've made things complicated," Schultz began without turning. "I've made things stable," Bumpy replied. Schultz faced him slowly. "Stability depends on hierarchy." "Respect," Bumpy corrected gently, "depends on equality." The word lingered like a challenge. Schultz stepped closer. "You survived something that should have ended differently." "I survived because it was not my time to fall." "You think this is about morality?" Schultz asked, frustration creeping into his tone. "This is about control." Bumpy's voice remained steady. "Control built on humiliation eventually collapses." The tension thickened. Two philosophies stood face to face, one rooted in dominance, the other in dignity. Schultz studied him for a long moment. "What do you want?" Bumpy answered without hesitation. "Fair treatment of Harlem businesses, no hidden pressure, no intimidation. And in return? In return, stability benefits us all." The audacity of negotiating as equal startled even Schultz. For decades he had dictated terms. Now he faced a man who neither flinched nor groveled. The turning point came not through raised voices or veiled threats. Bumpy reached into his coat, not for a weapon, but for a folded newspaper clipping. But not in sensational language. It focused instead on community response, on unity, on restraint. "You attempted to make an example of me," Bumpy said quietly. "Instead, you made an example of Harlem's strength." Outside the window, Manhattan's lights shimmered. "If you escalate," Bumpy continued, "you risk strengthening what you seek to weaken." For the first time in years, Schultz hesitated. Silence stretched across marble floors. Finally, Schultz exhaled slowly. "You're either very brave or very foolish." Bumpy inclined his head slightly. "History will decide." The meeting ended without handshake. Yet something fundamental had shifted. No grand treaty was signed. No dramatic announcement followed, but the economic pressure eased. Shipments resumed. Banks withdrew reassessments quietly. Harlem breathed. A little easier when Bumpy returned across the river that night. Snow falling gently around him, there was no parade awaiting him. He did not seek applause. He walked past storefronts glowing warmly, past families laughing over modest dinners, past children building snowmen on corners once tense with uncertainty. Inside the grocery store that had nearly closed, shelves were stocked once more. The elderly couple stood behind the counter, eyes bright with relief. "You did something," the wife said softly. Bumpy shook his head. "We did something, because that was the truth." The victory belonged not to one man, but to collective resilience. In the months that followed, Harlem's confidence deepened. The Savoy thrived. Churches expanded outreach programs. Young men spoke of business opportunities instead of street feuds. But it had lost its power to intimidate. Dutch Schultz's influence continued to wane quietly, not because he was defeated violently, but because his model of control no longer fit a changing world. Bumpy Johnson remained composed, never boastful, never reckless. The threats deliberate, the stakes high. But the response had been measured, strategic, dignified, and sometimes the most powerful revolution is not loud. Sometimes it is a community choosing unity over panic. Sometimes it is a man refusing to bend under humiliation. Sometimes it is silence that shakes a city. By the time spring crept cautiously into Harlem, melting the last of winter's bitterness from the sidewalks, the streets carried a different kind of tension, quieter, more deliberate, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't paying attention. The Savoy's music still rose like prayer into the night air. Children still chased rubber balls along brownstone stoops. Vendors still called out prices in voices that blended exhaustion with hope. But beneath the rhythm of ordinary life, something colder had begun to move. It was no longer about blades or broken supply lines. It was about reputation. And in that era, reputation could be dismantled faster than a storefront window. Bumpy Johnson understood that physical threats were simple. You could see them coming. A man with a weapon, a raised voice, a hostile stare, these were straightforward dangers. But slander, whispers, insinuations planted carefully in newspaper columns and police briefings, that was a battlefield without visible trenches. And it was on that battlefield that his enemies now chose to fight. It began with a headline. Not just a subtle suggestion printed in a downtown paper that Harlem's recent economic cooperation might mask something more sinister. It questioned undue influence. It hinted at coercion. It suggested that Bumpy Johnson's calm authority might conceal a tyrant's hand. The article never accused him outright. It simply planted doubt. Within days, city inspectors began visiting Harlem businesses more frequently. Licenses were scrutinized. Permits were re-examined. Fines appeared for minor infractions that had been overlooked for years. Police patrols lingered longer on certain corners. Someone was trying to prove that Harlem's unity was not resilience, but rebellion. One afternoon, Bumpy sat in his modest office above a storefront. Sunlight slanting through blinds and casting striped shadows across his desk. A folded newspaper lay before him. He read every word twice, not because he believed the lies, but because he needed to understand the strategy behind them. A knock came at the door. It was the young pastor from 135th Street, face lined with concern. "They claim we've exceeded occupancy limits." Bumpy nodded slowly. "And have you?" The pastor shook his head. "Never." Bumpy leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Then they're not after permits. They're after perception," the pastor realized. Bumpy's gaze remained steady. "Exactly." Mothers shopping for groceries whispered about inspections. And Frustration, if not managed wisely, could explode. That evening, Bumpy walked through the neighborhood alone, hands folded behind his back. He stopped at storefronts. He listened to grievances without interruption. And when tempers flared, he lowered his voice rather than raising his own. "They want a reaction," he told a group of agitated young men gathered outside a pool hall. One of them snapped. Bumpy met his gaze calmly. "We endure it, and we outlast it." The young man scoffed, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes. Endurance was harder than retaliation. It required patience in the face of insult. Dining room where crystal glasses caught chandelier light, a different conversation unfolded. Dutch Schultz sat across from a city official whose influence extended quietly into regulatory departments. "Public opinion," the official remarked, slicing into his steak with clinical precision, "can be shaped. Then we increase scrutiny." Schultz's jaw tightened slightly. He survived physical force. Let's see how he handles isolation. Isolation. The word carried more weight than any threat. Because if Harlem began to doubt its own leader, the unity he had nurtured would dissolve without a single shot fired. Within weeks, the whispers grew louder. Anonymous letters circulated. Concerned citizens questioned whether Bumpy's guidance truly served the community. It was a calculated psychological campaign. One Sunday morning, as congregants filled pews beneath stained glass windows, two uniformed officers entered quietly and sat near the back. Their presence was not disruptive, but it was visible. Afterward, a group gathered outside, voices tense. "This is because of him," one woman whispered. "Because of the attention." The seed of doubt had been planted. It was the same intermediary who had once warned him of looming threats. But this time, the man looked more troubled than ever. "They're preparing something official," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "A public hearing. They want to question your influence, make it look civic, lawful." "A hearing invites testimony," he said finally. "They expect people to stay silent. Silence born of fear. That was the gamble. If Harlem stayed quiet, it would appear as though loyalty was coerced. If they spoke rashly, it would appear." The hearing was scheduled at City Hall on a gray Thursday morning. Reporters gathered eagerly, sensing controversy. Politicians adjusted their ties with rehearsed neutrality. The gallery seats filled slowly, mostly with curious onlookers and skeptical downtown observers. And then, something unexpected happened. But in steady procession, shopkeepers in pressed suits, mothers in modest dresses, pastors, teachers, barbers, tailors. They filled the gallery silently, their presence speaking before any testimony began. Bumpy entered last, his expression calm. The chairman of the committee cleared his throat. "Mr. Johnson, concerns have been raised regarding undue influence over Harlem businesses." Bumpy inclined his head slightly. "Concerns are healthy," he replied evenly. "False assumptions are not." A murmur rippled through the room. The questioning began. They asked about economic coordination, about community meetings, about relationships with local leaders. Bumpy answered each. Inquiry without defensiveness. He did not attack. He did not deflect. He explained patiently how cooperation had emerged from necessity, how businesses supported one another voluntarily during hardship. "Are you suggesting," one councilman pressed, "that your influence is purely benevolent?" Bumpy paused, allowing the weight of the question to settle. "Influence," he said quietly, "is measured by trust. If trust disappears, so does influence." The chairman turned to the gallery. "Would any community member like to testify?" For a moment, stillness. Then the elderly grocer stood. "My wife and I have run our store for 30 years, he said, voice trembling slightly. "When suppliers abandoned us, Mr. Johnson did not threaten anyone. He asked neighbors to help. They did." Another figure rose, a young teacher. My students received books when funding fell short, she said. No cameras, no conditions. One by one, voices filled the chamber, not dramatic, not theatrical, steady. The narrative downtown had attempted to construct began to crumble under lived testimony. Schultz, listening to reports later that evening, felt something unfamiliar, a flicker of recognition. This was not rebellion. It was loyalty earned without coercion. Back in Harlem, the hearing's outcome spread quickly. There were no charges, no sanctions. The scrutiny eased, at least publicly. But the true turning point had not occurred in City Hall. It had occurred when Harlem chose to speak. That evening, as twilight painted brownstones gold, Bumpy walked alone past the Savoy. Music drifted into the street, vibrant and defiant. He paused briefly, listening. The young man who had once questioned endurance approached cautiously. "They tried to break you," he said. "They tried to test us," Bumpy corrected gently. "And we passed?" Bumpy looked toward the glowing windows where couples danced freely despite months of pressure. "We proved something," he said softly. "That unity does not require shouting, and dignity does not require permission." The young man nodded slowly, understanding dawning. Downtown, in quieter rooms, Schultz poured himself a drink and stared out at Manhattan's restless skyline. He had expected conflict. He had prepared for violence. What he had encountered instead was something far more difficult to defeat, a community aligned not by fear, but by mutual respect. Power, he realized, was changing, not disappearing, changing, and at the center of that shift stood a man who never raised his voice, never boasted of victories, and never allowed humiliation to dictate response. Harlem did not celebrate the hearing with fireworks or parades. It celebrated by reopening shops, by filling church pews without fear, by letting children laugh without glancing over their shoulders. The attempt to fracture trust had failed. And in its failure, it revealed a deeper truth. Character withstands scrutiny when it is rooted in authenticity. Bumpy returned home that night and removed his jacket slowly, careful of scars that still lingered beneath fabric. He stood before a small mirror, studying the lines etched by experience. He did not smile. He did not frown. He simply nodded once to his reflection, as if acknowledging that the hardest battles are often the quietest. Outside, Harlem pulsed. With life, not loud, not reckless, but resilient. The city had tried to break his name. Instead, it had strengthened it. That by the time summer arrived, Harlem no longer felt like a neighborhood under siege. It felt like a neighborhood under watch. Not the watch of protection, but the watch of calculation. Windows were observed, movements noted, conversations quietly reported. The public hearing had not humiliated Bumpy Johnson, it had elevated him. And elevation, in a city built on invisible hierarchies, was often interpreted as defiance. Dutch Schultz had learned something uncomfortable in the months prior. Direct confrontation with Bumpy strengthened him. Economic pressure had failed. Public scrutiny had failed. Violence had failed spectacularly. Each attempt to weaken Harlem had instead reinforced its unity. But power rarely retreats without one final gamble. This one would not be loud. It would be personal. The rumor began subtly. A whisper that Bumpy had grown too comfortable. That he had begun meeting privately with officials outside Harlem. That perhaps his calm negotiations were self-serving. It was not framed as accusation, only curiosity. And curiosity spreads more efficiently than hostility. At first, Bumpy ignored it. He had grown accustomed to gossip as a tool of intimidation. But when the whispers reached the ears of teenagers on Lenox Avenue, when a young boy asked his mother whether Mr. Johnson was switching sides, he realized this was different. This was not an attack on his strength. It was an attack on trust. Trust had been the foundation of everything. Without it, unity dissolved. Late one evening, Bumpy sat alone in his office. the faint hum of summer insects drifting through the open window. The city sounded distant. The moonlight cut across his desk in pale silver lines. He unfolded a letter that had arrived anonymously that afternoon. No threats, no demands. Just a sentence. Even your people will doubt you eventually. He placed the letter down carefully. For the first time in months, the battle felt close. Not external, internal. Because doubt inside a community is far more corrosive than hostility from outside it. The next day, Bumpy did something unexpected. Instead of calling a private meeting with business leaders, instead of confronting rumors, through intermediaries, he announced an open gathering at the Savoy Ballroom. Not for defense, for transparency. The Savoy had witnessed blood and unity. By sunset, the ballroom filled not with dancers, but with residents, mothers, shopkeepers, young men who once tested his patience, pastors who once sought his counsel, even skeptics who had begun listening to whispers. There was no band playing that night, only silence. Bumpy walked to the center of the dance floor, no podium between him and the people. He wore no extravagant suit, no visible display of power, just composure. "I've heard the rumors." He began quietly, his voice carried without effort. "I have never asked for blind loyalty," he continued. "Only honest partnership." A murmur stirred the crowd. "If you believe I have acted against Harlem's interest," he said, "say it here, ask me directly." The invitation shocked them, because leaders rarely invite challenge publicly. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then an older man near the back cleared his throat. "They say you've been meeting downtown alone," he said carefully. "I have," Bumpy replied immediately. "Because negotiation sometimes requires quiet rooms." "Are you making deals?" a younger voice called out. "Yes," Bumpy answered. "Deals that prevent conflict from reaching your doorsteps." The honesty unsettled those expecting denial. A young woman stepped forward. "Why not tell us everything?" Bumpy's gaze softened slightly. "Because some battles are quieter than others, and not every conversation requires spectacle." Silence deepened. Then he said something that shifted the room entirely. "If my leadership depends on secrecy or fear," he said calmly, "then it deserves to end." A ripple moved through the crowd. "You have the right to withdraw your trust," he continued. "Trust is not demanded, it is earned daily." That was the turning point. He did not defend himself aggressively. He did not blame external enemies. He offered choice. And choice restored power to the community. An elderly woman who had lived through decades of injustice stepped forward slowly, leaning on a cane. "When the inspectors came," she said, voice steady despite age, "you didn't hide. When the papers lied, you stood in City Hall. When violence struck, you said, 'No more.' I don't need whispers to tell me who you are." Applause began not thunderous, but rising organically. One by one, others spoke. Not rehearsed testimonies. Not dramatic speeches, simple affirmations. Observations of consistency. Stories of quiet help never publicized. The rumors dissolved in the presence of shared memory. Downtown, reports filtered back quickly. The attempt to fracture Harlem from within had collapsed. Schultz listened without interruption. He had underestimated something fundamental. Bumpy's power did not reside in control. It resided in credibility. And credibility, once tested publicly and affirmed collectively, becomes nearly unbreakable. But fate, indifferent to politics and rivalry, had its own script unfolding. Shortly after those events, federal pressure intensified against organized crime figures across the city. Investigations expanded, old alliances fractured. Schultz himself faced increasing scrutiny unrelated to Harlem. The underworld was shifting, not because of one man's influence, but because an era was ending. One evening, Bumpy received word that Schultz had been gravely wounded in a separate conflict. Some in Harlem expected celebration. After all, history between them had been tense. Instead, Bumpy's response stunned even his closest allies. He removed his hat and stood in silence. "Why?" a young associate asked, confusion evident. "Because rivalry does not erase humanity," Bumpy replied quietly. There would be no gloating, no vindictive remarks. Only acknowledgement that cycles of dominance eventually consume themselves. In the days that followed, Harlem continued not with triumph, but with reflection. The true victory had not been over a rival. It had been over despair. One late summer night, as warm air drifted through open windows and distant jazz echoed down Lenox Avenue, Bumpy walked alone once more. He paused outside the grocery store that had nearly shuttered months earlier. The shelves were full. Children ran past him without fear. The young man who once demanded retaliation approached again. "You could have crushed them," he said softly. Bumpy shook his head. Crushing breeds replacement enemies. And restraint? Restraint builds endurance. Bumpy looked toward the skyline where Harlem met Manhattan's glittering towers. "It's enough to sleep at night," he said. The summer faded slowly into autumn. The city moved forward, but earned quiet. They would speak of a man who answered humiliation with composure, answered scrutiny with transparency, and answered doubt with invitation rather than intimidation. On his final evening in this chapter of life, Bumpy sat by a window overlooking the neighborhood he had refused to abandon. He had never claimed perfection, only responsibility. It had tried to fracture him with rumor. But legacy is not built on noise. It is built on consistency. The blade had failed, the whispers had failed, because dignity, once chosen and demonstrated. And Harlem remembered.